Communications Group. And today we're excited to share with you the next featured section of the first ever Talos Year in Review report. This report represents a large-scale effort within Talos to tell the story of our work across the last year. It's a lengthy report, certainly, but one you'll want to go through completely. You can join thousands of your colleagues and customers and download that full report now at blog.talosintelligence.com. As always, there's no email gate or charge for any of our research. This report itself features the expertise of a talented and diverse group of people, including our reverse engineers, detection specialists, data scientists, linguists, threat hunters, incident responders, and threat intelligence analysts. They combed over everything that we've observed in the threat landscape in 2022. And this data-driven story gives you insight into Cisco and the security community's most notable successes in 2022, and also looks forward to the remaining challenges ahead going into 2023. The report was launched just before the holidays, already gathering many downloads and getting a good bit of positive feedback. So again, we'll put that link up. It's blog.talosintelligence.com/year in review to download that report. It's split into 4 sections, and today's broadcast focuses on the second in a series of 4, or rather is the second in a series of 4, covering each section of this report. Now, on this topic, some folks rather vocally feel it gets outsized attention in defensive circles, that focusing on fundamentals is far more important than concerning your team with boogeyman and the specter of uncommon but powerful adversaries. Still others will tell you that we need to talk about this elephant in the room as often as possible because it isn't going away anytime soon. The fact is, this topic, the actors involved, and the structure supporting them are all outsized by their very nature. As such, we feel a research-based discussion that's free of FUD is probably not only warranted, but maybe even necessary. Of course, the topic I'm talking about is advanced persistent threats, or APTs. Today, we'll cover the top APTs we documented in 2022, looking at some of the traits we use to track them over time, key behavior trends, and the tactics, techniques, and procedures, or TTPs, that they use. And you'll hear that phrase a lot today, TTPs. We'll talk about where those APTs are aligned, sponsored, and conducting business. Plus, we'll give our thoughts on the APT landscape for 2023. Before we dive into introductions and meet the panel, a quick reminder on questions and answers. If you're watching us live, please submit your questions to the panelists through on the live stream throughout the time we're together. Either a reply tweet on Twitter, if you're watching us there, or in the comments if you're watching us on the LinkedIn event. We'll be gathering those up, and I'll ask them on your behalf towards the end of the broadcast. For today's discussion, I am delighted to be joined by 3 people who have been closely involved in tracking, documenting, and researching APTs over time. They've also been instrumental in pulling together the data for our Year in Review report. First up, we have Jacob Finn, Threat Intelligence Analyst for Cisco Talos, and he's been a primary contributor to the APT section of this report. Jacob, can we start, just kind of kick off today talking about what you do here at Talos and what are some of the things that your team does?
Yeah, hey Mitch, definitely. So I'm an analyst in the Threat Intelligence and Interdiction organization, part of Talos. Our group is comprised of threat research teams, threat hunting teams, and the strategic analysis team. Broadly speaking, all of our teams work to ensure that we have the most complete understanding of changes in the global threat landscape, and that we capture and convey that understanding to our customers. I specifically am a member of the strategic analysis team, and our team is a core intelligence gathering and analytical group within Talos. We focus on validating and extracting key findings from Talos's research and incident response engagements, malware reverse engineering teams. We provide analytical insights on threat actor behavior, as well as identifying and tracking new and emerging trends in the cyber threat landscape. At the end of the day, we're most focused on providing our customers with the most up-to-date and comprehensive threat intelligence so that they can be as well-informed as possible when it comes to decision-making.
Fantastic. Can you give us a quick overview of what's included in this section of the report, as well as like kind of your approach to covering APT activity? Just a brief overview is fine.
Sure.
We're going
Yeah,
to get into it the rest of the time today. So
definitely. So the APT section of the report covers a pretty wide range of threats, threat actors, which are either state aligned or state sponsored. In other words, meaning that their main objectives and ultimately their operations and their victims are typically consistent with the objectives of the national government to which a given APT might be linked. The state sponsored threats we researched may be directly or indirectly supported by their governments and therefore may have access to funding and resources that are generally not available to your regular cyber criminal. We looked at several groups stemming from Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, as well as tracking several actors in the South Asia and Indian subcontinent region. We were most interested in tracking a variety of malicious activities, which included espionage campaigns, data theft, such as with intellectual property, and campaigns which deployed either destructive or disruptive malware. As I alluded to earlier, for our approach, our researchers looked at a whole year's worth of threat intelligence, including information from Cisco's telemetry sources, findings from our incident response engagements, as well as expertise from some really amazing Talos subject matter experts, including two of my awesome colleagues on the call today, Vitor and Ashir. So this is a really important report that I think will help a whole host of customers ranging from leadership all the way to network defenders.
fantastic. And speaking of your colleagues, next up we have Ashir Malhotra, threat researcher here in the Talos Outreach Group. Ashir, people watching may recognize you. You do a lot of research on APTs here. We from Gamerodon, Lazarus, Transparent Tribe, Muddy Water. You've been associated with a lot of the research we've done on APTs over the last years, so you obviously have some experience and expertise. So in that vein, can you tell us a little bit about your role and your approach to APT research?
Sure. Hi, Mitch. I'm a threat researcher at Cisco Talos, and I focus on tracking nation-state sponsored attacks all across the world. In 2022, I've been working on tracking adversaries operating specifically out of the Middle East and Eastern China. The intention of our research is to find new and novel attacks and campaigns conducted by APTs across the world. So basically, we separate the known from the unknown, the crimeware from the suspected targeted APT attacks, and we track them and we enhance our intelligence across the world for such attacks.
Okay. I was going to ask just how you, like what parts or how you contributed to this report, but I think more interesting would be to like, of what you contributed to this report, what stood out to you the most as you look back on 22 with respect to APTs?
So a lot of our research into Russian, Iranian, and North Korean APTs made its way into the end of the year report, and this is work that I've done with Vitor as well. But what really stood out to me is the sheer volume of APT campaigns we've seen this year. From the North Koreans to the Pakistani APTs, everyone is just getting bolder and bolder with a diminishing regard for disclosures as a deterrence mechanism. So the sheer volume is something that, that keeps me up at night and something that we've observed over the past year or so. Now, while some APTs do still care about stealth and protection of their infrastructure to the point that they will voluntarily do takedowns of their infrastructure once they have been publicly disclosed, there's still a fair volume of APTs that will continue to operate business as usual even after their campaigns have been publicly disclosed. And that's something that we will continue to see in 2023 as well.
Fantastic. And last but certainly not least, Vita Ventura, technical leader on the works also on the outreach group there, threat research. How you doing today?
Doing pretty well, thank you.
Fantastic. Your name often appears alongside Ashir and a lot of other APT research work. You've also been at this for years. So can you tell the audience a bit about your role within Talos and what's been your role in APT research and the associated intelligence efforts primarily over the last year and in this report?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a security researcher with Cisco Talos Outreach, and I on one side I like a lot of APTs and focusing on those kind of groups. I also dedicate some time to mobile threats, mainly with Android threats, which we have seen some groups moving towards that space also a lot. On the APT side, I think that it's really important to look into what has been happening for the last couple of years, so that we can have an idea. And Ashir touched a little bit on that when he talked about the non-deterrence. We have seen that growing and growing, and groups which have been exposed don't really take down their operations, or they don't really go into the effort of changing a lot of their TTPs. So I think that is happening more and more, and that gives us a good idea of what's coming up in the near future, because the more these groups don't feel the need to change their TTPs, the more aggressive they will become, and the more they don't really have a motivation to stop their operations, right? So that brings us to the point where we need to be careful, be aware of them, and know their TTPs, and know how they operate and their motivations more, so that we can better protect against them.
Yeah. I mean, as the very name suggests, APT groups can be very difficult to eradicate, from any network once they find their way in. They achieve a lot of persistence along with multiple means of access. In addition, the research that you gentlemen have done has shown that these groups are continuing to adapt to defenders. They are, choosing at times to update their tooling and evolve their TTPs, or not if they don't need to. The challenges that we face there include responding to ongoing changes, as well as figuring out those new and evolving threats that they pose. So naturally, that increases the degree of difficulty, I guess, in attributing that activities to specific groups and figuring out exactly what's going on. So I'll start this question with you, Vitor, and really we can branch it out to everybody. So in light of that, how is Talos able to monitor these groups and kind of figure out what is going on in such a diverse set of threat actors who have a very unique and diverse set of capabilities?
Well, I would say that it all starts with the great visibility that we have into the threat landscape. And from that, we collect that visibility transforms into something which is the telemetry that we get from the products from Cisco, the indicators that we get from partners and from other OSINT sources. And then we transform that into something that can be associated with actors, with a known data, with a known set of information that we already have from the experience that we gathered over the years, but also to new stuff that we are working on. And that allows us to transform all this telemetry and visibility into context that can be applied to our information, and transform that into actionable intelligence, which then can be used to track the adversaries and to put into the products and deliver to our customers a lot of the context that they need in order to better protect themselves against these kind of threats.
So actually, you mentioned a great word there, a great phrase, actionable intelligence. I kind of want to zone in on that before we actually answer the question all the way around. So maybe let's zone in the answers to the question on that. So how do we use that research that we're discussing to create what you said is actionable intelligence for our customers? Jacob and Ashir, you can also jump in there.
I'll say in addition to the telemetry, we're also able to gain a lot of threat intelligence findings from our partners, which include government agencies, law enforcement, and even other private sector companies. For example, Cisco is a leading member and contributor to an organization known as the Cyber Threat Alliance, which allows cybersecurity companies to share information with one another. And with the information that we receive from our partners, we can then pivot using our own internal sources and provide actionable intelligence to our customers. What that means is these come in the form of alerts and bulletins. Beyond, for example, these intel sharing partnerships that we have, Talos operates its own NDA intel sharing program, which we call Aegis, which allows us to share customized intelligence reports to any members of the Aegis program, as well as receive intelligence back from them.
And to add to Jacob's point, actionable intelligence doesn't just consist of providing intelligence briefings to our customers and partners. We also provide various types of protection mechanisms, which make their way to our customers and partners in the form of threat grid or behavioral protection, or even traditional signature-based mechanisms like CLAM, AV, and SNOT signatures, all to protect our customers and the whole world as a whole. So.
Fantastic. So to kind of drill down or maybe give a good overview of some of the actors that we'll be talking about and these APT actors. This one I'll start with you, Jacob. In the report, we organized the top adversaries that we researched and we worked around and worked with. So those top adversaries and threats are kind of categorized by country of origin. So can you summarize those adversaries and the type of threats that they have been using in their attacks, just to give us a quick overview of that short summary of the report?
Yeah, so again, we looked at APTs stemming from Russia, Iran, China, North Korea, and South Asia. Obviously, with Russia's war in Ukraine, we closely studied a lot of the threats associated in that part of the region. These have mostly been involved in destructive campaigns, intelligence collection, and also influence operations. 3 of the APTs we identify are Fancy Bear, Turla, and Gamerodon. And Gamerodon in particular has been incredibly active, conducting aggressive spear phishing campaigns against Ukrainian government users. In the first few months of the war, we also tracked several of the destructive wipers, such as Whispergate, which bore resemblance to the NotPetya wiper, which impacted Ukrainian and global organizations around 2017. With Iran, we reported on the Muddy Water APT group, which is a state-sponsored espionage group. Likewise, particularly active were China state-sponsored espionage groups, including Mustang Panda and Deep Panda. These groups were really interested in targeting certain industry verticals, which we believed were to support China's strategic and economic objectives. I would say in several cases, we saw APT groups exploiting known software vulnerabilities, Log4j in particular. Deep Panda was one of those groups, as was the notorious Lazarus group from North Korea. We've seen many of these groups deploy things like custom implants to avoid detection and to maintain persistence. They've also used open source exploitation kits and local operating system tools, which allow them to maintain access and move laterally and collect intelligence, et cetera. And lastly, like I said, we track South Asian groups, including some linked to Pakistan and India. For example, Transparent Tribe is a Pakistan-linked group, which we observed sending phishing lures to target students and university departments located in India, which is kind of interesting because in the past they used to target mostly militaries and government organizations. So really, there's just been a whole lot of APT groups around the world who, in 2022, I would say, were really adapting to the changing geopolitical landscape.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to direct this next question to Ashir, and I think we'll start there, but I have a feeling everybody else may want to jump in here too. But to start with you, Ashir, looking at the research we did for this report, there's obviously, and the summary that Jacob just gave us, there's a large volume of data there from a lot of sources. So could you maybe give us a high level or a summary of the main APT behavior trends that we found across these APT-based cyber attacks this year?
Sure. So something we've seen increasingly happen in 2022 is the interleaving of custom-made bespoke malware families with open source and commercially available frameworks like Metasploit and Impacket and Cobalt Strike. APT actors are using their own custom-made families along with these readily available frameworks as well. Another thing that we've seen specifically this year is an increase in the use of remote control software such as Screen Connect and remote utilities. The Iranian APT Muddy Water is a prime example of that. They love using this, and they've accelerated the use of these remote control utilities. One other thing that we've seen is the increasing use of reverse shells, basically small implants that open up a command prompt that give you the ability to execute a wide number of commands on the infected endpoint, by an APT operator. Something that we've seen absolutely increase over the past year or so. Chinese APT groups like Mustang Panda rely heavily on reverse shells. Even the APT groups operating under the Lazarus umbrella, the North Korean APTs, heavily rely on the use of reverse shells as well. So this is something that we've seen over the past year or so in terms of APT behavior trends.
I think also, I think also on that, and specifically for this year, I would point out the return of the wipers. This almost seems like a movie, a movie name, but we have seen a lot of wipers attacks, mainly related with the war in Ukraine. But for a while, that wasn't seen, and this year we had a lot of wiper attacks with the pure intent of destruction of infrastructure, and that is something that everyone should keep in mind, because even though in the remote chance that you can recover everything from backups, because most of the time that would fail somehow, that takes a lot of time, and it takes a lot of capability to restore everything. So that's something that most people should, and our audience should take into consideration, is that they have never gone away, but this year that it really proves that there were a lot of those attacks during the beginning of the war, at least.
Victor, do we see a lot of things that are cyclical like that, like trends over time? Like, so in the longer term, not just over this year, like what's old is new again. You mentioned that, like the wipers, like the return of the wipers, like this is something we haven't seen for a while. Is there a lot of that old is new again, returning to older cycles, kind of a? Or is there a longer term trend, I guess?
Yeah, I wouldn't say that we can see that. So, for instance, we could think about the ransomware, which has evolved from single operations targeting individuals to something that evolved into big game hunting. I wouldn't predict that would go back to the individual ones. So I wouldn't say that we have a lot of those. What we can have, and picking up on what Ashir said about the reverse shells, is that reverse shells that we have seen over this year, they were humanly operated mainly, and we could even see they typing the wrong commands and then typing again, and I would say that we can see that in conjunction with automated tools to script some parts of the attack so that they can be faster while performing them instead of typing the wrong things. Mm-hmm. And that would make them more aggressive and faster in the way that they gather into intelligence and establish persistency.
And to add to Vitor's point, the Vipers that we've seen this year have been highly targeted in nature. Like they don't really have worm-like capabilities, which suggests that they are trying to serve the intentions, or they're trying to serve a purpose that aligns with the specific nation-state group during the course of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So that's something that's a little different from the Vipers that we've seen in the past.
Yeah. Jacob, you have anything to add on trends there?
Oh yeah, it was funny because you mentioned what's old is new again, and there's another section, not part of earlier on in the end of year report, which describes a recent trend our Talos incident response team responders began noticing in our engagements, was the use of malware that is spread through USB drives and other types of removable hardware. And
SneakerNet's alive and well, huh?
Yeah, right. SneakerNet. And like, for example, I think one of the incident response engagements had to do with they found a PlugX variant that was associated with Mustang Panda, and a PlugX is generally associated with a lot of Chinese state-sponsored groups. And so this is just kind of surprising, because another TTP that has been cycled and recycled over the years, obviously stressing the importance for organizations needing to practice better USB hygiene.
Fantastic. So I guess we'll go around the horn with this question as well. Starting with you, Vitor. The global geopolitical environment, obviously, we've mentioned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, as well as some other factors that definitely contributed to a more complicated and complex geopolitical environment globally this last year. So the state-sponsored or state-aligned APTs adapted to a lot of those geopolitical changes, as we've kind of started to touch on, particularly those Russian APTs in response to the war in Ukraine. So can you tell us how, again, we'll start with you, Vitor, how these APTs were observed to change and take advantage, specifically how they were taking advantage of a complicated or complex geopolitical environment?
Well, for starters, I would say that APTs, they have used the war, the invasion, as a lure, just like they used COVID and the Olympics before that, as a general thing. Not specifically talking about the Russian ones, but about the other kind of APTs. They have used it as a lure, and that is not a change in itself, because we have seen them taking advantage of the environment as is. So COVID was there before that, the Olympics and everything. So that's something that
World
will
Cup,
happen.
what have you, yeah.
Yeah, whatever. It's on the news at that moment. But on the other hand, the complexity of the environment right now, it did give APTs additional motivations, and that's that's where I think we should think about, is that, of course, with the Russian invasion, a lot of the APT groups related with Russia were attacking Ukrainian institutions, but we also cannot forget that we are in a post-COVID world. And COVID did change a lot of the geopolitical global environment. And there were a lot of countries that figure out that they need to do more manufacturing in-house, in-country, not have everything shipped, because we all saw what happened during COVID. And I think that will definitely change the way that the APTs work right now. Because with that, there will be a lot more. If you have to build more stuff in house, you need more know-how, and know-how and needs research, and that requires investment, and it's way cheaper to steal it. So I wouldn't be surprised if we start to see APTs with different motivations, especially trying to figure out new ways of doing IP theft and that kind of things. I think that's a change that we might see as a consequence of the more complex geopolitical, but not just limited to the war in Ukraine, but also with the post-COVID world that we are now in, and it has changed a lot of the ways that the world is working, the globalization.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting take on global supply chain pressure and APT activity. I hadn't even thought about that. Jacob, Ashir.
Yeah, I mean, similar to Vitor's point, I was probably most interested with the non-Russian APT groups who were taking advantage of the Ukraine crisis. Our end of year report calls out Mustang Panda, who I just was talking about before, that they had changed the themes of their phishing attacks to relate to themes related to the war, so Russian war activities. And even prior to that, they were using things related to European Union activities. And also not, we're talking about APTs, but even the great amount of cyber criminals that got involved, such as ransomware gangs. A separate part of our end of year report actually discusses some findings related to the ransomware as a service community and how several of those groups began announcing they were picking sides, such as the now disbanded Conti group, who had said they were siding with the Russians. So again, beyond just the Russian APTs, it seems like there were just far more stakeholders in 2022 when it came to the outbreak of the war.
And to add to Jacob's point, and to reiterate Mustang Panda again. Apparently, it's a favorite among all of us.
Yeah.
We've seen Mustang Panda use topical events over the past few years. Like this is a practice that they've adopted into many of their campaigns all over the world. Such as lures that are related to COVID-19, international conferences that are happening in a specific part of the world that are being organized by entities that they are interested in, such as policy groups or think tanks. However, this year, because of the geopolitical environment, we observed a substantial increase in Mustang Panda lures that were related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine specifically. And what's interesting here is that their campaigns indicated a potential targeting of both sides of the war, not just Europe and European entities, but we also have indications that they potentially targeted and made attempts to attack Russian entities during the course of the invasion as well, which is very opportunistic, and it's purely based on the geopolitical environment that we're seeing right now.
Cyber criminals finding an opportunistic way to take advantage of a situation? I never. So from all of your, all three of you, from your experience in researching APTs over the years, we've talked a lot about the macro environment, the macro trends, APTs as a whole, right? Is there anything we can call out about the way these adversaries specifically have targeted and executed against their victims? Are there any notable aspects about the way they carried out their attacks in 22 that we'd like to call out now? Fighter, we can start wherever. I would like to get all three of your input. Let's just keep going the same way.
Okay. Well, I would like to, going back to the old is new and new is old. The most notorious attacks that we have seen lately coming from APTs have had two big sources. One, it's the usage of stolen credentials. And that means that the attacks start from the inside out. And on the other side, it's the supply chain attacks.
Mm-hmm.
So these are two relatively easy ways for them to get in and to start, which in fact, what this creates is that it kind of levels the playing between APTs. You don't need to have a huge resources to do an attack. You can be a small country with some smart guys, and they will do this kind of attacks and start from the inside out. So I would urge everyone to, for one side, keep their credentials safe, to have multiple factor authentication, that kind of stuff, which kind of breaks these attacks, because it's really hard for organizations to defend the endpoints to their maximum. So they must always take account into what may happen, that they may lose credentials. So having this will help them to defend themselves. And this, of course, we are talking about APTs, and people might think, okay, but this is our small time, or this is crime. Well, in fact, the worlds are merging more and more when we think about the initial vectors. It's just a question of economics. It's much cheaper to buy a credential that costs $200 rather than pay $1 million for a zero-day exploit. So that's just not.
And really defending against those software supply chain attacks we saw last year is an extremely difficult proposition, right? Especially when you have those ubiquitous like Java libraries and things like that are used like across everything.
Well, I would even go with a simpler example, which is some sysadmin that just likes their Python scripts and they import a module. Just this Christmas, we have a hiccup, a scare somehow, because there was a Python library that might have been compromised, and it turned out it was just a test from someone. But if that library had been compromised, it would give access to probably, well, I wouldn't say, I don't want to talk about percentages, but to a large part of the companies in the world that use artificial intelligence.
Yeah,
and we all know
another log4j. Yeah,
exactly. So that's the other point, which is securing the supply chain attack, having an idea of what they are using, where it comes from. It's a difficult task, but if we look at SolarWinds, if you look at all of those kind of attacks, or even NotPetya, it's the most notorious one, that was a supply chain attack. So that's something that it's hard, but the sooner we start, the sooner we can actually protect against it.
And there's a whole host of challenges, even in that like software bill of materials, like the simplest forms of defense there's still challenges present. Ashir, Jacob?
So of my two observations, the first one I think had to do with, again, the software vulnerabilities that actors are using to gain initial footholds, right? We've been talking about Log4j utilities now, and it's, when did it come out? Like over a year ago was when it was published, and yet APTs are still kind of banking on the fact that they know many victim companies are just either not applying the proper patching or just not remediating. Second observation, I think, and this kind of is pretty self-evident, right? These groups are persistent, right? They're advanced persistent threats. They're not just relying on a single backdoor to maintain their access. They're going to deploy a whole host of other implants and tools and privileges so that if one gets discovered, they have many other alternatives. And so it's important for organizations to realize that state-sponsored groups are always looking for different ways to compromise networks. And they have a whole host of other mechanisms at their disposal. So network defenders, right, really need to maintain vigilance and awareness of what is normal versus what is not normal activity occurring in their environment.
To add to Jacob's and Vitor's points, in terms of distribution vectors, we still continue to see a lot of APT actors rely heavily on the use of social engineering. For example, smaller groups such as Aided Viper have been using decoys and lures that are related to the individuals that they've been targeting for quite some time, and we saw this in 2022 as well. Meanwhile, there's other smaller groups such as the Pakistani APT group called Transparent Tribe, which has started using fake installers for legitimate applications to infect users in the Indian subcontinent. Another thing that we've observed over the course of this year is that we're observing a shift in the usual delivery channels by a lot of the APT groups, from malicious documents, which now carry the mark of the web, to more non-traditional file formats such as archives and ISO files, etc. For example, I'm coming back to Mustang Panda again. Mustang Panda relies very heavily on the use of archive files to deliver their malicious implants to the individuals that they are targeting. Also, we've seen Muddy Water, which is an Iranian APT group, invest heavily in the distribution of phishing emails that now provide malicious download links to their malicious artifacts instead of just wrapping the malware up in archives and sending it out to their victims. So while these techniques, and this goes back to what's old is new, Mitch, while these techniques aren't anything novel or then nothing groundbreaking in the threat landscape, we've observed a definite shift in the usual TTPs of specific APT groups that are now starting to explore these non-traditional delivery mechanisms. And then, of course, as Jacob mentioned, we're still seeing a heavy emphasis on the exploitation of end-day vulnerabilities. For example, last year, we saw the Lazarus APT group target multiple energy providers in the United States, Canada, and Japan by exploiting Log4j vulnerabilities. And this was as late as the middle of 2022. So about 8 months after the Log4j vulnerability was publicly disclosed, out to the public, they still continue to rely on end-day vulnerabilities and the fact that a lot of organizations aren't patching their systems.
Fantastic.
So that example that I should just give, it had also the same thing as Jacob was mentioning, which was after they exploited, they would create users and assign it privileges so that they could go back if their implants were discovered, just like what Jacob was mentioning. That is a good example of everything in one single actor.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Exactly, and coupled with the fact that they were creating backdoor users, they were also rotating their implants. There's like 4 or 5 implants in the same breach, in the same successful breach, where one of them was pulled out and another one was deployed. So this shows that they're like constantly churning out methods to have persistent access into their victims.
Oh, that's terrifying. But yeah. So just I want to jump in with a quick reminder. If you're watching live, please go ahead and submit your questions. If you're watching on LinkedIn, in the comment section there, or a reply tweet to the Twitter event, we'll be collecting those, and I'll ask those on your behalf here soon. So let's jump back in with another question. We noted in the larger report, in the bigger whole report there, that this year we observed more APT activity in our CTIR Cisco Talos incident response engagements than usual. We touched on that a little bit earlier. That included Iran state-sponsored Muddy Water group, as well as several China-affiliated APTs that all of us have, all of you guys here on the live stream have published on. Those engagements allowed us to get a deeper insight into their operation. It enhanced our general understanding of them, of those specific APTs. So could you provide some examples of how something learned in those engagements really made a material, if maybe somewhat invisible on the surface, improvement in how we defend against a specific threat? I believe that when we talked about this earlier, actually, Muddy Water was the one that came to mind. If you want to start that one off for us, Ashir.
Sure. So we've been tracking Muddy Water for quite some time, and when we started taking a look at their recent campaigns, it's we found a pattern basically, and it's very important to understand your adversary if you're to defend against a specific adversary. Their likes, dislikes, the TTPs that they usually employ during the course of their attacks, and during the course of investigation of different campaigns. So we took a holistic look at different APT campaigns conducted by Muddy Water in different geographies across the world. And we figured, there's basically a pattern that started to emerge where there were certain commonalities between the different campaigns that were conducted by the Muddy Water APT group, which we now believe is an umbrella organization that consists of smaller subgroups that will focus on specific geographies in specific parts of the world. And what emerged was the group likes to reuse some of their tactics that they have honed and that they found worthy of reuse from a completely separate, disparate campaign. But at the same time, in their current campaign, they will also introduce one new technique, which they will test, which is basically experimental in nature, and they will test the effectiveness of that. And if a technique or a tactic has been proved worthy, they will then add it to the pool of common techniques and tactics, which can then be used by a different subgroup under the same umbrella of APT, of the APT organization that is Muddy Water, in a completely different campaign. So that's something that's not really visible, and that's something that a lot of people tend to miss if you look at one campaign or if you look at campaigns in silos. But looking at all of them together, this is one very interesting pattern that came out over the course of this year.
Excellent.
I would add also about the Lazarus one, if I may. I really like this one, so I wanted to talk about it.
Yeah.
So Lazarus, they this year we found a new implant from them that used Qt framework, which is it's a framework used to make user interfaces. And you would think that, well, an implant doesn't have a user interface, so why would you use it? And in fact, what happened is that this ends up to be kind of an abstraction layer that allows them to code the malware once and reuse it on multiple platforms just by recompiling it. And this is something novel that Ashir and I found on a specific Lazarus attack, which was really, really interesting. And it was written from scratch. They didn't pick up something that they already had and repackage it, which often happens with APT actors. No, they started this from scratch, which is quite an interesting one.
Interesting. All right, so this is going to be the last question from me before we go to a couple audience questions that we have and then close up for the day. So if you do have a question, make sure to get that in, like we mentioned before. Jacob, I want to ask you this question. So going back and revisiting some of the things we were talking about with Ukraine, bearing in mind that our combined efforts in helping protect critical infrastructure in a war zone, in a nation struck by war, can you share some general guidance or advice to any defenders who are watching on how to protect their critical infrastructure from sophisticated advanced actors?
Yeah,
I mean, real quick, if you can, 5-10 words, if you could
there's no one silver bullet, right, to make the APT threat go away.
Right.
While APT activity might sound overwhelming, I don't think this part of the report is meant to make it sound like APTs are going to win this fight, right? I hope that network defenders read the APT section and see the trends that we've observed so that they can then take measures to mitigate activity we've seen. Obviously, better cyber hygiene is an absolute must. So many of the organizations that we saw who were compromised in our incident response engagements probably could have been, these incidents probably could have been better avoided had there been better security awareness and procedures. Because we're talking about APTs, defenders, network defenders really need to come with the mindset that attackers are constantly probing their environments, looking for ways in. And so as such, organizations really need to adopt a defense in-depth strategy so that should one defensive layer fail, there are going to be additional layers there to protect. For one thing, there needs to be continued employee training to monitor, for example, phishing attempts, which obviously we observed was one of the primary infection vectors. And in the event that an employee does provide credentials to an attacker, had there been multi-factor authentication implemented, then that would have been another layer to prevent compromise. Segmenting networks would be an additional layer to stop APTs from moving laterally. Again, I think looking at some of the techniques we've talked about here today, some of the techniques APTs have been using, such as living off the land binaries, that would kind of imply that these tools should be automatically restricted when there isn't any type of legitimate business need for them. Software patching, right? I can't stress that enough. Maintaining a regular schedule to help mitigate the risk of software exploits. And then I think lastly, particularly when it comes to APT groups, I think it's really important for network defenders to have a strong understanding of geopolitical events going on in the world, whether it's things like COVID-19 or the war in Ukraine. We commonly see these national interests at play, which tend to drive APT attacks and intentions. So taken together, I think these will be the best approach for defending against these very sophisticated nation-state actors.
Awesome. Thank you for your very frank answers and very deep explanations on all this stuff today, guys. We do have a couple questions that I want to get to. I think this one may go back to an earlier comment we made in the live stream, but I guess this goes for everybody. How do you think APT attacks and activity influences opportunistic or the more petty cybercrime that we see?
Well, I guess I will take it first. I would say that, as I mentioned before, credential theft, it's a point where you see cyber criminals, smaller cyber criminals, join up or touching point with APTs through the selling of credentials. It's so at the beginning that was more about ransomware groups, but more and more we see that APT attacks start from the inside with stolen credentials, because as I said, it's just easier. And that I would say that it may be at the bottom of the food chain, but in reality is really providing food for all the other groups going up. I think that's a really important point that we need to think about.
Jacob, Ashir, anything to add to that one?
Frankly, I think it's also a two-way street. So there's a lot of cybercrime organizations and conglomerates these days which are pretty sophisticated, and there's a lot of smaller APT groups that tend to follow them and learn from them as well. So that they can have better operational practices and they can enhance their technical skills as well. So I'd say that it is also a two-way street when it comes to learning from each other.
Fantastic. I know we have we do have a couple of hard stops here coming up, so I want to get through this last question to our close here. But I thought this one was pretty good. So we've talked about APT detection and a lot of the TTPs they use. So this question is, how do we use those TTPs to actually create detection or security content? Like, how are we detecting them based on TTPs? Can you give a quick overview of what that looks like for somebody who may not have written security content before?
So I can start here, Mitch. We have all sorts of detection mechanisms. You know, we have behavioral detections, we have reputation-based convictions of network infrastructure, and of course we have the traditional means of signature-based detections as well. And we also follow the MITRE attack matrix very closely in order to make sure that any new techniques introduced in the matrix make their way to our detection mechanisms, so that we can provide comprehensive coverage to our customers and our partners as well.
Fantastic. Anybody have anything to add to that? Or there's one more question that came through that I think is a good one to end on. And this one will go for all three of you. You can answer quickly if you like. What keeps you up at night?
Besides my kids, I would say supply chain attacks, to be honest.
Supply chain attacks. Good one.
I would say 0-day exploits, really the ones that we
what are you going to do?
What do we do until it's too late? And I feel like in 2022, we began seeing a lot more organizations coming out with software patches for vulnerabilities out of band, right? Not on patching Tuesday, that like it's been out of band. And I think that kind of, it's a little scary because it's demonstrating a lot of groups I think are becoming more technically sophisticated than in the past.
And well, I would say social engineering attacks and bad cyber hygiene. Like, you'd be surprised how many of these attacks can be blocked and can be protected against if someone didn't open an attachment they weren't supposed to open, or didn't click a link that they weren't supposed to. Because at the end of the day,
will click on anything, huh?
Exactly. And at the end of the day, these are not new techniques. Like, these are very, very old techniques that we've been seeing for like the past decade or so, which which implies that a lot of the APTs aren't really advanced. They're just using what is a proven technique. They're just using something that has a high rate of success instead of innovating all the time. So
yeah, it's a numbers game. Somebody's going to click eventually, right? Like somebody's having a bad day and not paying attention. But to the point, I like the point that several was made a few times here. That it's those simple solutions that like using MFA or making sure that a certain application is restricted in your environment, stacking that defense in depth, stacking those kind of simple solutions makes things infinitely more complicated. I think that was a good takeaway from today as well. But that is about all the time we have for today's broadcast. So if you're watching this, I would encourage you to grab your copy of the Talos 2022 Year in Review Report. Share that with anyone you think would benefit from the resource. It's available now again at blog.talosintelligence.com/year in review, hyphenated as you would expect it to be. We can put that up on the screen. But thanks again to the tremendous team effort that is represented, the dozens and dozens and dozens of folks that are represented by these three gentlemen here today. And my special thanks specifically to Ashir, Jacob, and Vitor for joining me today on today's broadcast. This Friday, be sure to listen to a new Talos Takes podcast on this topic. And some of our guests from here on today's show will be on that podcast as well. And that'll be available at the same link that you see on the screen, as well as in all your favorite podcast platforms. We'll be back with another live stream in just a couple weeks, featuring our experts who have been heavily involved in the next section of the report. And they'll go over the continuing impact of Log4j and some other items related to the threat landscape. But for now, we hope you enjoy the read. And thanks again for watching us. And please have a great day.